The Bucks take care of business in Utah. They have now won 8 of their last 10. Giannis, Dame, Khris, they all led the way, scoring 92 of the Bucks' 125 points. Is the Bucks big three back? Do the Bucks have a big three? We're going to discuss all of that and more on the other side of the intro.
You are Locked On Bucks, your daily Milwaukee Bucks podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
What it do? Welcome to Locked On Bucks, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. I'm Camille Davis. Joining me is Justin Garcia, and we truly do appreciate you for tuning in and making Locked On Bucks your first listen every single day. We are free and available wherever you get your podcast, as well as on YouTube. Plus, you can catch us in newsletter form. Head over to lockedondaily.com and start your day off with the Locked On Bucks newsletter. Super Bowl 59 is here, and there is no better way to make every play more exciting than with FanDuel Sportsbook. New customers can bet just $5, and if you win, you will score $200 in bonus bets. So download the app or head to FanDuel.com to get started. Justin, we saw the Bucks get off to a little bit of a slow start, but then they got rolling, and once they got rolling, they really couldn't stop. Utah did get a chance to cut that lead down to 3 a couple of times, but Milwaukee pulled away for good in the second half. We had Giannis and Dame both scoring 35 points apiece. Khris Middleton bounced back from his poor performance against the Clippers with an efficient 22-point game. But what stood out most to you from the Bucks' big three?
The efficiency, I would say. I mean, you mentioned the slow start that the Bucks got off to. They finished the quarter strong, the opening quarter, and then at halftime they were shooting 63%. They finished shooting 61% for the game. So, save for those first 3 or 4 minutes of the game, I mean, they were incredibly efficient, and especially that trio of Giannis, Dame, and Khris Middleton. I mean, in the starting lineup, Giannis and Dame went 30 of 45, and you add in Khris, you go 40 of 58. I think that was 80% shooting from that trio. So this was the best their offense looked in terms of their crispness and, all the things that Doc has talked about that have plagued the team of lack of ball movement. They had that one sequence where they moved it around the horn twice to find an open look. I think it was Dame
on the
that
wing,
knocked down the three. So, yeah, just how efficient they were offensively and crisp.
Absolutely. The efficiency definitely stood out. You don't tend to see guys put up those big of numbers while being that efficient in the process. And to your point about just how the offense looked, I saw Eric Name after the game. He asked Dame, he asked Khris. I think he even asked Doc Rivers a bit about just how the big three got their buckets tonight. And Doc Rivers mentioned, I thought that they scored it organically. Like, nobody really forced it. Like, they weren't trying to do it. They just happened to do it in the flow of the game. Plus, Khris had really good legs. You could see that he was in good spirits, good rhythm. And Dame, I love when Dame gets asked questions post-game because he always goes so deep into how he's feeling about it. And he mentioned, this is what we're capable of doing. And it was all rhythm and flow. It was smooth. It wasn't my turn. It wasn't your turn. It was just seeing how the game was evolving and trying to take advantage of mismatches and get easy buckets. And they did that consistently throughout the game. We've seen situations, games, where it seems like that Bucks offense stalls a bit, or you get into the hero ball, the quick shots on the shot clock, or taking too long to even initiate an action on the shot clock. But I felt like this game against the Jazz, and albeit it's against the Utah Jazz, but they still had to put the ball in the bucket, and they did it in a way that didn't seem to be forced at all.
Yeah, 69% shooting too by that trio. In a game where you shoot 61% from the floor. So that was a big part of it. But I heard that those remarks from Doc on our post game too, and it's what stood out the most. And it was a couple of areas that the Jazz were winning that didn't become an issue for the Bucks, and I think a big part of that was the efficiency numbers, that they just continue to hunt the most efficient shots throughout the game. But we've talked about Giannis kind of taking a possession or two at times to figure out how the defense is playing him and how to attack from there. I thought that was really evident tonight, where after, again, the midpoint of the opening quarter, there was just no answer for him when your defense is Micah Potter and Drew Eubanks. Giannis was just in downhill mode all night long, and between Giannis getting to the rim, Dame getting into the paint, 8 assists again, so 29 assists in the last 3 games for Lillard. Those two constantly playing downhill, it just opened up, and the reason why the Bucks shot 61% and were consistently shooting 60% was it created the most efficient looks on the floor. That they shot 77% in combined attempts on corner threes and at the rim.
Like, that's crazy efficiency. And to see Khris get into it after the game that he had against the Clippers, I loved to see him bounce back in that way. Like I said, sometimes guys have bad games. Doesn't necessarily mean that they're a bad player. And for Khris coming into the game, I really wanted to see him establish himself. I wanted to see him bounce back. I wanted to see him get more involved. That was something that Eric Name focused on an article at The Athletic. Doc talked about it after that Clippers game of just saying they need to make sure that Khris is also more involved. And that's on them. Like, we got to make sure that he's getting his touches. And I feel like against the Jazz, they did a great job of making sure that he was involved in the game plan. He was aggressive as well, in addition to his teammates looking for him when he got the ball and he felt he had an advantageous matchup. He attacked it. And it was really good seeing Khris do that, because I do still think ultimately, if this is the main roster, post-trade deadline, the Bucks are going to need Khris Middleton to be the guy that we saw tonight. You have to be somebody who can make the right play. You can't be hesitant. You have to just get the bucket, do your job. And there are some people who say, like, hey, the Bucks don't even have a big 3 anymore. They're really just like the Bucks' highest 3 paid players at this point. Do you still consider them to be a big 3? And do they necessarily need to be that, or do they just need guys that are playing, their roles, playing at a good rate come playoff time?
Yeah, I hadn't thought about it recently is it still considered a big 3? I mean, I think the reality is they just need Giannis and Dame to be 2 of the 10 to 15 best players in the league, and then get that consistent offense from secondary scores, which they've really gotten since the first 10 games of the season. So yeah, we've talked before about the trade for Damian Lillard and how much it changed things for Khris Middleton, that it kind of removes some of the pressure from him. I think that still exists. That being said, if you can get, even 80% of what we got last night from Khris Middleton on a consistent basis, I feel really good about this team's chances against anybody in the Eastern Conference.
Same here. And Khris played 27 minutes against the Jazz as well, the most we've seen him play since the end of December, when he was still inserted into that starting lineup. So hopefully Chris's health is also on that right track, where you can continue to increase those minutes and get him into a really good flow come playoff time. But we spent a lot of time talking about Giannis and Dame and Khris, and for good reason, with the performances that they had against the Jazz. But I do want to talk a bit more about some of the other guys, the rotational guys, who also had a big impact on this game right after this. FanDuel is here for you throughout the Super Bowl run, because Super Bowl 59 is here. 1 game, 2 teams, endless possibilities. And there is no way to make every play more exciting than with FanDuel Sportsbook. Whether it's predicting the first touchdown, calling the MVP, or even betting on the coin toss, FanDuel makes it easy to get in on the action. With live betting all game long, you can adjust your bets as the game unfolds and feel the thrill from kickoff to that final whistle. The live betting feature lets you stay involved no matter what happens on the field, and the app is super easy to navigate. Plus, knowing that you can place a $5 bet and potentially win $200 in bonus bets for the Super Bowl, that's just icing on the cake at this point. So download the app, head to FanDuel.com to get started. Bet just $5, and if you win, you will score $200 in bonus bets. That is FanDuel.com. So bet with FanDuel, official partner of Super Bowl 59. The others, Justin, the others, key guys, with 2 rotational players out in this game still, as we saw against the Clippers. No AJ Green, no Bobby Portis. Doc went 9 deep, which is what he normally likes to do with his rotation, but when you look at the box score, you realize like, hey, Pat Connaughton and Ryan Rollins cracked that 9-man rotation, but they each only played about 7 minutes apiece. So with so much of the attention, again, rightfully so, on the big three, who else stood out to you in this game against the Jazz?
Yeah, I was going to say, for all intents and purposes, it was 7 deep that we saw Doc go with this team, which was very interesting for net one of a back-to-back for this group. And, even leaving the door open before the game about the possibility of Khris Middleton playing in both of these, saying he's going through the usual routine. We're going to see if he feels good enough, because he really wants to be able to play in both of these games and test it tomorrow. So that was the biggest surprise to me, that the rotation was as trimmed up as it was in a back-to-back for this group. But the role players that stood out, I thought Gary Trent Jr. was fine. Knocked down 2 threes, continues to show you what he brings defensively and just being a pest for this team.
Mm-hmm.
But Andre Jackson Jr., I think a lot of times people can take it as Andre Jackson Jr. hate when we're critical of some of the things that he's struggling with offensively. But I thought this was a terrific game from Ajax tonight. 26 minutes is among the most he has played in a game this season. And again, when you really pare down, and I know you were down a couple of rotational pieces, but with a trimmed down rotation, that was one of the things that struck me the most when you looked at his minute totals throughout the game and thought, man, we're still seeing Ajax here in fourth quarter and third quarter. That, okay. But he really found ways to be effective from the dunker spot. All 3 of his baskets were dunks. It's something that Doc has talked about a number of games. He mentioned it again last night after that game of like, this is what we're working with Andre on, of really trying to find how do you make the most of those spots around the basket and how do you open up looks for other guys. And I think we saw that. His defense, his energy as well. We'll take the last 52 seconds out of the game.
Do you think that should have been a flagrant 2, by the way?
No, I don't. But it was definitely a flagrant one with the windup. And you could see as it happened too, Doc was kind of sharing some words with Ajax, and he's talked about it before, of some of the miscues that Andre Jackson Jr. will make. And Doc saying, like, I don't want to pile on the guy. Like, that's not the part of coaching. He knows he made a mistake as well. We'll revisit it the next day. I got the sense that was the conversation that Doc was having with him in the moment too, of like, there's 52 seconds left. Like, let's just get out of here. And Doc even said himself, I didn't think it was a flagrant 2, but I could see the physicality between he and Colin Sexton starting to pick up. And I think the official's point was just 52 seconds left. Like, let's make sure nothing happens here. So I'm getting one of these guys off the floor.
Love that when he did leave the floor, though, they just shook hands like, hey, man, it wasn't anything like that. Like, we just competing, Andre is kind of like that irritant type of defender. So seeing him in that situation didn't surprise me. I was surprised to see it being a flagrant 2 for him. But someone else who stood out to me was Taurean Prince, and not because of the scoring. He only had 6 points. He was 2 of 6 from the field, 2 of 5 from 3. But he had 8 assists in this game, which I believe is a season high for Taurean Prince. Again, I think it just shows he was somebody who was also involved in making sure the ball was moving. It's not just on Giannis and Dame and Khris. They're the start of it for sure, but you need other guys to understand the flow of the game. And I thought Taurean Prince did a really good job of moving the ball, finding other guys, and finding ways to be effective, even though he only had, as mentioned, 2 made buckets in this game. But I was impressed with Taurean Prince. Andre Jackson Jr. stood out to me as well. Looks like he's getting that practice for the dunk contest at this point, and I hope that continues for him going forward. Seeing, as you mentioned, Gary Trent Jr., the shot wasn't falling for him, but I thought that he was still productive in his minutes. So I don't have any qualms about that. But I really do, if I could have any qualm about this game as a whole, I just wish that the Bucks were able to rest some of their guys a bit more than what they were able to. Seeing, Dame hit 41 minutes, seeing Giannis with 37 minutes in this game felt a little high, especially knowing that they have the Blazers today, second night of a back-to-back.
Yeah, it was a 20-point game going into the fourth quarter, and Giannis sat the first 6 minutes of the fourth, and you can't help but think, man, if the Jazz didn't get that thing down to 12, do we even see Giannis in the fourth quarter? Do you pull the plug on Damian Lillard after 2 or 3 minutes in the fourth quarter and get some rest for those guys. So I agree. That was the only nitpick with the performance. I mean, it wasn't a wire-to-wire victory, but it was pretty close. That it was early in the first quarter that the Jazz led. And that's what we've seen more and more of from the Bucks this season as well is, they're not letting opponents back into the game quite as much. I mean, it's going to happen in the league with 3-point shooting that we always joke no lead is safe. But, and I suppose to that point, we saw the Jazz even playing the foul game down 13.
Down 13 with like 20 seconds left. At that point, you got to let it go. Let it go.
But yeah, I mean that, and look, we've seen some of the comments too, and I heard other people pointing out last night too of the so what it's the Jazz. Like, yeah, I mean there is truth to that, but also this is what the Bucks struggled with a season ago. So while it may not be a major takeaway, it is something to note of. All right, this team is like consistently starting to put teams away now when it's inferior competition.
Yeah, and I see we are recording this live on YouTube. That'll probably be the schedule tomorrow as well with this West Coast trip and some later games. But Simeon's in the comments. I believe I mispronounced your name. My apologies. But as you mentioned, he said it's the Jazz. No credit, unfortunately, but happy we won. And not even just going back to last season. Earlier on in this season, we were seeing this team drop games to teams, and it was baffling of like, why can't the Bucks seem to beat teams that are under 500? I mean, we're going to talk about the Blazers a bit more in the next segment, but even with the last loss to Portland that the Bucks had at the beginning of this month, they had lost 2 straight 4 or 5, and each of those losses were to sub 500 teams. And it was the point in the season where you're like, what is happening? Why is the attention to detail not where it needs to be? Why aren't they executing at the level that they need to be against these teams? What is it? So to see them come out against the Jazz and really kind of put their foot on the gas and continue to drive the whole game, even though the Jazz threatened a few times, I felt really positive about seeing their effort with that in this game. And before we move on to the Blazers, I do also want to shout out really quick, Brook Lopez. Thought that he was really stout defensively. We talked a bit about how certain matchups and how the Clippers kept bringing him to the perimeter, which lessens his effect. You want to try to keep Brook as close to the rim as possible. But I did think that Brook Lopez also had a really good game against the Jazz. Again, might not wanted to see him play 35 minutes. I know Doc was like, nah, 35 is fine. It's when Brook gets up to 40, we don't want it. But Brook's been an Iron Man for this team, and I thought that he also had a really good game against the Jazz.
Yeah, and he had a Giannis-esque near chase down block too. And Doc also, to that point, had said after the game, like 37 minutes, I think we can make too much out of this at times, that if you play, let's say, back-to-back 40-minute games or 3 straight games where you're pushing 40 minutes, the next game, we're going to play you like 25 minutes or so, and that starts to even out the averages. So we're not overly concerned with it. And also, the team had, I hesitate to call 3 days off because we chronicled last week just how strange it was, but you had 3 days with no games last week where you anticipated to play at least one of those games. So Doc's point of that does kind of buy some minutes for these guys along the way, I think is a valid one.
Yeah, I think that's a good perspective to have when thinking about how the minutes work. So good point, Doc, of bringing that one up. Appreciate that outlook on it. As mentioned, the Bucks have another game tonight. Second night of a back-to-back. They are going to be heading to Portland for a national televised game against the Blazers. What to expect and what should the Bucks look out for? We'll talk a bit about that after this. So when the Bucks last saw the Blazers, they lost that game by 3. 9 p.m. start today on TNT, another late one for the Bucks. But what are you looking to see from the Bucks tonight? As I mentioned, they had lost last time we saw the Blazers. They had lost 2 straight 4 or 5. All those losses were to sub 500 teams. This time they're coming into it having won 8 of their last 10. Portland's coming into this game having won 4 of their last 5, surprisingly. But that last game that they lost was the last game that they played against the Thunder. So what are you hoping to see from the Bucks tonight against the Blazers?
I mean, I'll just distill it down to this, Camille, a win. That game, too, was, I hesitate to use the word disaster, but it was part of a really bad week for the Bucks to open up the calendar year at home. That was the Anthony Simons essentially game winner when he had the 3-point play with 5 seconds left to ice it. So it's going to be a matchup that, again, you are expected to win against inferior competition. So I just look to see more of what you saw tonight, where you come out, move the ball around. I'm not expecting 63% shooting for the duration of the game, but find efficient shots and offense and take care of business on that end. I wouldn't even say, well, the Bucks have been much better defensively since that game, because they were already playing better defensively since prior to that first loss against the Portland Trailblazers. So just don't shoot yourself in the foot, right? It's what we talk about so many times with this team. Don't turn the ball over. You do have to do a better job on the defensive glass, as that's something that the Bucks have consistently been doing better, but it feels like every now and then it starts to pop up. Again, it was certainly an issue against the Clippers on Saturday night, and even last night against the Jazz. You gave up 15 offensive rebounds. Now, you regrouped and made sure that there wasn't a whole lot of damage done. I think the Jazz only scored 8 or 9 points off of those second chances. But you don't want to get into the business of, all right, we're giving up these offensive rebounds, but we're going to dig in defensively. So just keep those things in control. Don't allow the Blazers to dominate on the offensive glass, and don't turn the ball over to give a team that likes to get out and run transition opportunities.
Yeah, you kind of hit on the two things that the Blazers actually do well, because when you look at the numbers alone, like the offense, bottom third of the league, like they just don't do many things well. The defense, bottom third of the league, not great. But what they do somewhat well offensively is that they crash the offensive glass. Like they like to get those second chance opportunities. They're fifth in offensive rebounding percentage. And on defense, they like to force turnovers. So they do get active in that. They're 11th in turnover percentage on defense as well. So times when the Bucks can be sloppy, turning the ball over, which you saw early on in that Jazz game as well. Just the ball is just not doing what it's supposed to be. And sometimes that's just the guys continuing to get used to playing with one another. Like against the Jazz, I remember a turnover that Giannis had where he thought that Ajax was going to stay in the corner. Ajax was cutting out. Ball sails over Ajax's head, out of bounds, turnover. Just cleaning those things up and getting used to playing with some of the guys rotationally, I think is really important for this team as well. Cut down on those turnovers, take care of the ball. Don't end up in situations where you are pre-constructing what you think you're going to do with the ball, and just reading what the actual defense is giving you, I think will be really helpful for this team. And then for the Bucks, like you said, just really take care of business. Don't necessarily play with your food. This game is going to get a lot of attention, because it's, again, Dame's return to Portland. It's not his first one. And the first return to Portland didn't necessarily go the way that the Bucks were hoping. So hopefully this time in Portland, the Bucks can get that win.
Yeah, I mean, I suppose the other option is Warriors Jazz, but that was boy, this is really a TNT game, huh? Dame returning to Portland part 2. The other thing I think is going to be critical is the Blazers give up a lot of shots at the rim. I think they're 25th in opponent frequency of attempts there. And as we've seen through the years with this Bucks team with Giannis, if you get shots at the rim, you're typically going to convert there. So this has the potential to be a big points in the paint game and just shots at the rim. They scored 64 last night, the Bucks did, which was a season high. And they're in the bottom 10 in corner three attempts and opponent shooting percentage from the corners there. So as we've seen too, you get Giannis and Damian Lillard playing downhill and getting into the paint, it opens up a ton of looks from three, especially those corner threes. So, I mean, you limit the turnovers, you limit the damage on the offensive glass and finish those possessions. If the Bucks take what the Blazers are likely to give them on the offensive end, this should set up for a similar result to what we saw in Utah against the Jazz.
Yeah, and it should be another big Giannis game. Last I checked the injury report, Aiton was questionable, so we'll see if they have him there to kind of help shore up their big rotation. But otherwise, you're going to be counting on a lot of young guys to try to stop Giannis. And as we saw against the Jazz, when guys are seeing Giannis for the first time or the second time, it can be a bit of a wake-up call of like, oh, this is a different type of player that I'm having to battle against and go against here. So hopefully it's another game where Giannis can kind of come out, exert his will, and continue to create for others. But it should be a fun one tonight in Portland. As we wrap up here, I do see a comment that I want to address. I just want to get your opinion on this really quick, Justin, as we wrap up here. But the comment here is from Two Red Violin, just saying like, hey, as the Bucks are currently constructed, they don't necessarily match up well against the Knicks. Think they still need to add some complementary pieces, preferably a defensive-minded player, and athletic big that can help them. Do you still have any concerns? I should say still, but do you have any concerns about how this team is necessarily currently constructed? And are there any matchups for you that you're thinking about that are like, this matchup in the East is not one that the Bucks want to, get into come playoff time? And of course, just with the preface of saying there's still a lot of time. Teams are going to change in the next 2 weeks as the trade deadline comes and goes. But do you think as this team is currently constructed that they can go on and win some of those more difficult matchups, although we haven't seen them win any game so far against the top of the East?
I think they would tell you, as long as we're healthy, we like our chances. The Knicks, and I was on the squad show for the Eastern Conference yesterday, and this was one of the questions we had too of who are the Bucks most fearful of in the Eastern Conference. I don't know. I mean, I guess you would probably drift to the Knicks because of the results in those two games, and you can talk yourself into, hey, all three Celtics games were competitive. It was really just like a 4 to 6 minute stretch in the third or fourth quarter in each of the three games that doomed the Bucks. The Cavs games, as we've well documented, were the first two losses were by 3 points total, and that third one was their first game back from Vegas out of the NBA Cup. The Knicks were dominant performances, and that's the ones you look at and you say, okay, one was early in the season, but I know there was a lot of optimism, and this is our chance to show we are a much different team in that second one, and it was almost an identical result that we saw. So I don't know how much of that is the Knicks are just a bad matchup for the Bucks versus it was unfortunately two bad games that came against the same team this season. I would still maintain, and talking to others too, that this group remains extremely confident in their kind of company line is we were not healthy the last few playoffs. We believe in this team, and especially the growth they've shown this season. I mean, you and I have talked about it. I was just talking about it with somebody else last night too. Like, it is night and day the way this team looks and the way you feel about this team this year versus last year. And it's also interesting to bring that point up when we just passed the 1 year anniversary of Doc Rivers hiring as the Bucks head coach. Yesterday was the 1 year anniversary of the final game that the Front Dog coached as the interim head coach. And this game against the Jazz almost lined up to a year ago today, and part of that disastrous opening road trip for Doc Rivers. And the other interesting nugget from that, Camille, is that game, obviously we remember the Bucks went 1-4 on the road trip. That game in Utah, I think it was like February 4th or something. The Bucks lost 123-108. Up until the final, 40 seconds last night, it was 123-108 Bucks. And then Andre Jackson Jr. gets the flagrant two, and each team added 2 more points. But yeah, I think, and we're going to get into this throughout the week and next week as well. The challenge is, how much do we want to disrupt the apple cart? Because we do feel like we have really good chemistry. These pieces fit. It's not to say there's no upgrades that the Bucks can't make. I think we've talked about it before. You would still love another athletic big that you can throw out on some defensive matchups. You would love a shot creator as well. The Bucks and 80% of the league are in that department of, hey, we'd look for this if we can get it. You just really need to see competitive basketball in the final games you have left against the Knicks. The Celtics are done with, so the Knicks and the Cavs. Like, not even win, it just can't be a 20-point loss or a 25-point loss.
Yeah, and even some of those teams in the West. I mean, the Knicks had a big win last night over the Grizzlies, and that was the first Knicks win that they've gotten over a top 3 opponent in either conference. I mean, they're third in the East, so that kind of changes the mathematics a little bit, but that was their first big win over another team that was ahead of them in the standing. So a lot of teams are still trying to figure that out.
And I mean, the Boston Celtics lost again last night to the Houston Rockets. So look, the numbers are not on your side with your schedule and the fact that you don't have the tiebreaker against any of those 3 teams in front of you. But the door is definitely open for the Bucks to finish with the second best record in the Eastern Conference. They are still just 3 games back in the loss column of the Celtics. They're only 2 back of the New York Knicks. So you absolutely have to win that game against the Knicks, the lone game you have remaining, if you want to leapfrog them. But look, 2 and 3 game margins. I mean, you can make a case, well, the Celtics are going through it right now, but all that takes is a bad week or a bad 10-day stretch, and you continue to play solid basketball, and then you're tied, or you're a game back of them in the standings, and from that point, anything can happen.
It truly can, and the show keeps rolling for the Bucks tonight against the Blazers, hoping to see them take care of business and keep that rolling. Because as we discussed, they've had moments in the season earlier on where against these sub-500 teams didn't have the best focus, best effort. And as we mentioned, when trying to look at the standings here, they need to continue to take care of business along the way until they get to some of those more intriguing matchups, one might say, and then seeing what they can do there. But you don't get to those games against the Grizzlies, the Thunder, so on and so forth, until you take care of the games in front of you. And that starts with the Blazers tonight. So hopefully we get a Bucks win over the Blazers, and we will be back with more Locked On Bucks post-game show. Tomorrow will be another live morning show with the late tip-off in Portland. So Wednesday morning, join us live on our YouTube page for the post-game reactions to this game against the Blazers. And for Justin and myself, we'll end it here. Hope you all have a good rest of your day. And remember to keep it locked in to Locked On Bucks.